Ancient Rome is often viewed as one of the greatest cities in history, a place of magnificent architecture, ambitious engineering, and passionate culture. However, life in those days was not so pleasant. Crime rates were high, and punishments were severe. For some criminals, Rome reserved a punishment that was more about shame than instant death, being chained and dragged through the streets. This macabre form of capital punishment was not just about ending a life. It was about destroying a person's honor and serving as a warning to the rest of the population. This video will take you back in time to explore how this cruel practice evolved, why it was used, and what it reveals about ancient Roman society. We will discuss the reasons behind the selection of such a humiliating method of execution, the process involved from the moment of sentencing to the eventual death of the condemned, and the psychological aspects of this form of punishment, which aimed not just at inflicting physical pain, but at destroying a person's reputation and dignity. What better way to make an example out of someone than by dragging them through the streets for all to see? Dragging people through the streets has been a common form of punishment throughout history, dating back to ancient civilizations like the Romans. In ancient Rome, this form of punishment was known as being tied up with the proverbial shirt on your back, which would mean that they were only wearing the shirt and nothing else. They would be tied up with ropes and dragged around the city. This was seen as a punishment fit for slaves and other low-ranking individuals who had committed crimes against the state or other citizens. It was also used as a way to humiliate and shame the condemned, making an example out of them to deter others from committing similar crimes. But what made the Roman practice distinct was its complexity and brutality. Being chained and dragged through the streets of Rome was a gruesome affair. Unlike simpler forms of this punishment, the Roman practice involved elaborate preparations and a level of cruelty that set it apart. The condemned would first be stripped naked and then tied up with chains. They would be forced to walk or sometimes pulled or dragged behind a cart or horses as they made their way through the city. Along the route, the public would hurl insults and sometimes dirt or other objects at the condemned. The procession would often go around the most crowded areas of the city, ensuring that as many people as possible witnessed the spectacle. The journey itself could be a long and agonizing one, sometimes lasting for hours, as the procession moved from one part of the city to another. During this time, the condemned were subjected to the jeers and taunts of the crowd, which could be relentless and merciless. The Romans took great pleasure in humiliating the condemned, and no insult was too harsh or too degrading. The goal was to break the person's spirit and make them suffer not just physically, but also psychologically. While the intent might have been to cause as much suffering as possible, the actual outcome of this punishment varied. Some condemned might die quickly from severe injuries sustained from the dragging. Others may succumb to exhaustion or trampling by the crowd. However, that was not always the intention. Sometimes the organizers of the spectacle wanted to prolong the suffering of the condemned, keeping them alive as long as possible to maximize the humiliation and terror inflicted upon them. The slow and agonizing death of the condemned became another form of entertainment for the Roman crowds, who reveled in the power they held over life and death. The act of dragging the condemned through the streets was not merely a means of capital punishment. It was a display of power and control by the Roman authorities. By parading the condemned in such a manner, Rome demonstrated its dominance over its citizens and non-citizens alike. It was a way of reminding everyone that the power to punish and even take life was in the hands of the state, and no one was above facing the consequences of their actions. Furthermore, the use of chains and carts or horses added to the spectacle. The chains symbolized bondage and imprisonment, while the cart or horses represented the might and control of the state. The combination of these elements created a powerful visual image that was meant to intimidate and subdue the populace. It is essential to understand that the Roman Empire, like any other civilization, operated on the principle of maintaining order and control. The society was hierarchical and rigid, and any deviation from the expected behavior was seen as a threat to this order. Crimes were not just seen as acts against individuals, but also as offenses against the state and its authority. Punishments, like being chained and dragged through the streets, were therefore meant to reinforce the supremacy of Rome and its laws. It was a way of keeping the population in line and preventing them from challenging the established norms and rules. Moreover, the spectacle of dragging the condemned was meant to serve as a deterrent to others who might consider breaking the law. By making an example out of the condemned, Rome sought to prevent others from committing similar crimes. The humiliation and suffering inflicted upon the condemned were meant to be a lesson to the rest of the population, a reminder of the fate that awaited them if they, too, broke the law. Now let us discuss the evolution of this cruel practice. The practice of chaining and dragging individuals through the streets can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations. In these societies, it was used as a form of punishment for serious crimes, often involving theft or murder. However, the Romans refined and brutalized the practice to such an extent that it became one of the most terrifying forms of capital punishment in the ancient world. During the early days of the Roman Republic, criminals sentenced to death might be put to death quickly through methods like crucifixion or However, during the empire, when Rome's power reached its zenith, so did the cruelty of its punishments. The infamous Emperor Caligula is said to have introduced a more sadistic and humiliating version of this punishment, pulling criminals behind chariots, while they were dressed in the finest garments to emphasize their degradation. Subsequent emperors continued to refine this form of punishment, making it more elaborate and excruciating. As the Roman Empire grew, so did the scale and brutality of the public spectacles. The dragging of criminals became a major event in Roman public life, attracting large crowds who eagerly anticipated the spectacle. The more prominent the criminal, the more elaborate and humiliating the punishment was likely to be. For instance, the Emperor Nero reportedly chained his wife Poppaea Sabina to a chariot after she fell out of favor. He whipped her as she pulled him around, a display of power and control that shocked even the most jaded Romans. In the 2nd century AD, the jurist and philosopher Kant wrote of a case where a woman named Caeconia was chained to chariots, like a horse, and forced to pull the emperor's carriage. After completing the shameful task, she was beheaded. Another well-known case involved the philosopher and gladiator Epictetus, who was chained to chariots and forced to drag them while singing. When he refused to comply, they put him to death. Finally, we will delve into the psychological aspects of this form of punishment. Being chained and dragged through the streets was not just a physical ordeal, it was also a deeply psychological one. The Romans understood the power of humiliation and used it to its fullest extent. The spectacle of dragging a person through the streets in their utmost vulnerability was meant to shatter their dignity and break their spirit. The choice of location, the route taken through the city, and the timing of the procession were all carefully planned to maximize the impact of the punishment. The more public and humiliating the setting, the better. The condemned person was stripped of their clothing, their possessions, and ultimately their life. They were reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for the amusement and edification of the crowd. The public shaming and insults hurled at the condemned were designed to attack their self-worth and identity. The crowd took great pleasure in degrading the condemned, attacking them for their perceived flaws, mistakes, or crimes. The insults were often personal and cutting, aimed at humiliating the condemned and making them feel worthless. This psychological torment was meant to be a punishment in itself, a way of breaking down the condemned both physically and mentally. The Roman authorities understood that the fear of this punishment could be a powerful deterrent. By publicizing the details of the punishment, they instilled terror in the hearts of their subjects. People would hear stories of the horrible deaths and the public shaming that preceded them, and this would discourage them from engaging in activities that could lead to such a fate. In conclusion, being chained and dragged through the streets was a terrible form of capital punishment used by the Romans. It was an extreme and brutal method of dealing with criminals that combined physical torture with psychological humiliation. The practice served multiple purposes in Roman society, including maintaining order, deterring crime, and displaying the power of the state. While such practices may seem barbaric today, understanding them helps us comprehend the complexities of Roman culture and the lengths to which they went to maintain control and instill fear in their subjects. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it. You can also subscribe for more historical insights.